BI or Die, the podcast by Reporting Impulse about analytics, dashboards, and business intelligence.
Hello and welcome to our podcast, BI or Die. This is Kai, and together with my great co-host, Viktoria, we have today our first international guest from Ottawa, Canada. We noticed that already on side of the recording time. I think it's about 9 p.m. here in Germany. But first of all, hello, Viktoria. How are you?
Hello, Kai. Great to hear you again and to see you. This time with video.
That's fantastic. I mean, I spoiled it already, so I'm already like to share with you. Especially happy to welcome Nick Desbarats. You are a trainer, keynote speaker, consultant for data visualization and information dashboard design. I'm pretty sure that you left your mark globally. You influenced many conception of dashboards and also directly because you provided in-person workshops in over than a dozen of countries. So that's pretty amazing and really, really great that you're here. So how are you doing in Canada?
Probably slightly colder than you. Although it's not too bad today. But yeah, no, I've in fact, I've taught in Germany several times as well. Lovely country. But yeah, no, we're doing okay. Probably about the same as everywhere else, I think. Okay is about the best you can say in these times.
Yeah, that's true. But I also seen some of your recordings, and you often mentioned in your example, like in Germany or something. So if you talk about, the sales manager in Germany or something, at least I noticed that you at least think at some degree to us Germans.
I try and include examples from all over the world.
Yeah, that's cool. So maybe a little story how I met you more or less indirectly. It is already 4 years ago. I met Stephen Few in London. I was there for a long weekend with my wife. That was even the weekend of my marriage proposal. So very great memories for me. And Stevie had a training in London during that time. And we had the chance to have a little chat in a little cafe. And at that time, we just discussed our book at that time. And among other things, it was really a nice conversation. And he somehow left me a little speechless at the end of our talk, because he asked me if I could sign our book for him. And it was, oh God, it was so bizarre. The great Steve asked me to sign our little German book. So this was a really cool situation. And in this context, I also learned about you. I think you were the first and only one who was authorized to give his trainings, and also somehow took over from him. I think Steve has a very high quality standard. So maybe a few words about your experience with Stephen Few.
Sure. Yeah. So I first met Steve in a workshop that I took in 2013. And, before that, I basically, I was working at software companies in different roles. I started out as a developer, but then I moved into product management, marketing, eventually several kind of executive roles. But, for probably at least 10 or 15 years before that, I had just a strong kind of personal interest in cognitive psychology, the psychology of perception, judgment, decision making, and then when within an hour of taking Steve's workshop, I realized that this is what he was talking about. Right, this was not really a data visualization workshop. This was a psychology workshop, and so my two sort of major fields of interest, which were software and technology, and cognitive psychology and cognitive science, just sort of collided in my mind. And it was a pretty, eye-opening experience. And of course, just being in a Stephen Few workshop is, quasi kind of religious experience for most people anyways. He's an incredible teacher, of course, incredible expert. And so we just ended up chatting during the breaks and over the lunches about essentially everything but data visualization. Just like I said, mostly about psychology, but then going off into all sorts of other topics, philosophy and whatnot. And so we stayed in touch for the weeks and months after the workshop, and then at one point I just got kind of bored with what I was doing. Basically, kind of was head of analytics at a company, and I asked him if he'd ever had other people teach his workshops, and he had been asked, of course, in the past, but really it was by people who had strictly sort of data backgrounds, not a lot of depth in sort of psychology and decision making and perception. But again, that's really what Steve's content was all about. And because we'd been talking about that a lot, he was open to the idea. And then I started teaching his workshops following some pretty intensive training and study. He basically threw a whole pile of books at me and research studies. And and so after 6 or 7 months, I started teaching his workshops. And then, much to my surprise, he announced that he was retiring from teaching about a year and a half ago or so. And so I then became essentially the only person who was teaching his workshops. And so at the time, I also decided that I was going to start adding, 2 of my own workshops, because I just had a lot of ideas kind of percolating in the back of my mind. Teaching sort of the same sort of high level learning objectives, but obviously after having taught Steve's workshops, I don't know, I think 100, 150 times or something like that, I just learned a lot about where the gaps were in people's knowledge and the kinds of examples and ways of explaining things that really worked, with people and not. And then, of course, at the same time, I adapted it to online, which is a huge adaptation, right? Going from teaching in person to online, you can't just move the content, take that in-person content and just start teaching it online. You have to completely rethink it. And so all of these things sort of happen around the same time. And so now I'm actually teaching mostly my own courses. I still offer courses based on Steve's books, but almost all the teaching I'm doing now is my new course. Well, new, they're not really new anymore. It's been over a year now. Practical Charts and Practical Dashboards, which are my courses, which will be books by the end of the year as well.
I mean, you mentioned that you somehow establish your own books, your own trainings. Maybe you can give us a little update on the European dates, maybe for the trainings and also the publications for your books.
Sure. Yeah. So I teach usually about 3, sometimes 4 public workshops a year. Up until now, they've been at times where I teach them in the afternoon on, kind of North American Eastern time, which is sort of later in the evening for Europeans and early in the morning for people on the West Coast. But I've decided to actually offer a kind of a Europe friendly workshop starting. Well, there's going to be the Practical Charts course at the end of April, and then the Practical Dashboards course at the beginning of May. And so if people are interested in taking those courses, they're open registration, so anybody can register. It's hosted by CGI Norway, but it's a public workshop. And they can just go to my website, practicalreporting.com. And right at the top, there's like an announcement bar that has a link directly to the registration page. And then the books, well, the target is to have both of them out by the end of the year. Realistically, probably Practical Charts, which is sort of data visualization fundamentals, will come out by the end of the year. And then hopefully not too long after that, Practical Dashboards will come out. Probably in Q1.
So you're still busy writing on them and collecting ideas. And
well,
probably in your mind, everything is pretty clear, but really doing it, that's...
that's one thing that I learned from Steve, in fact, is if you want to write a book, create a workshop first, because every time that I teach the workshop, I am in effect beta testing the book, because the book is essentially a narration of the workshop. I mean, it's, there are going to be some things that are different, of course, but yeah. So now that I've taught the Practical Charts and Practical Dashboards workshops, I don't know, probably at least a few dozen times. And each time I refine and tweak based on, the questions that people ask and the comments that people make. I see where the gaps in people's knowledge are and which examples work well and which don't. And so all of that, of course, is going into the book. And so really, all the heavy lifting is done. Like I know exactly what's going to be in the books because I know exactly what's in the workshop. Right.
That's cool. I mean, we also have the hard question, the hard 5 questions right afterwards, but there are also some soft questions about you. And Viktoria, I think you prepared 3 of them.
Yeah, I just a short question before. Do you have a specific target group for your workshops and your books? Would you say it's really interesting for this kind of person?
Well, they're different for the 2 courses. The Practical Charts course, which is sort of data visualization fundamentals, is pretty broad. It's basically if you create charts, tables and graphs as part of your job, this course is going to be useful to you. And whereas for Practical Dashboards, of course, it's targeted at a narrower group. These are people who are directly responsible for either developing or designing information dashboards. But actually, the demand for both courses is actually quite similar, even though the target markets are very different in size. And of course, a lot of people end up taking both courses because I usually teach them in workshops. I'll teach both courses, and a lot of people sign up for both. Some people sign up for one or the other. And when I teach private workshops, which is actually what I do most of the time, I'll teach, anywhere from, at least 15 or so private workshops a year, where it's just for a single organization. And more often than not, they take both courses.
Okay, perfect. So now we know a little bit about the professional Nick. It's getting a tradition that we want to know a little bit more about the private Nick as well. So we prepared 3 questions. I hope they're not too hard, but I think it's fine. So just a short answer. It's enough, and we talk a little bit about later. So we start. 3 character traits that you make you stand out.
Ooh. I don't know about stand out, but if I were to sort of reframe the question, I know that's cheating probably, but as character traits that I think have served me well in the past, I think, probably number 1 would be curiosity. I mean, that's certainly how I ended up doing what I'm doing, right? Before I started talking to Steve, I probably read, 150 books about cognitive psychology and cognitive science and, artificial intelligence. And these are all things which, I didn't realize it at the time, but I was essentially training for doing what I'm doing now. But that was just because I was just inherently curious about those topics because they weren't directly related to my work. And probably, the second one might be maybe just sort of being kind of directionless, which might sound like an odd sort of, quality, if I were to put that in air quotes, because I don't make 5-year plans. I don't, for my entire life, I've been very sort of opportunistic in terms of just, keeping a very wide field of view and always looking for things out of the corner of my eye, as opposed to, having some sort of very, very specific objective. And so I've ended up doing lots of different kinds of jobs. I mean, generally in the sort of software/technology field, but I've been all over the organization in terms of job descriptions and even sort of subsectors within technology, from mobile to all sorts of other spaces. And I guess the other, if I had to come up with a third one, it would be something, and I can actually remember the exact instant where I developed that characteristic, or I learned that insight, was when I was in my early 20s. And at that time, I was a software developer, and I was designing user interface, which I thought was, of course, blindingly simple. Any monkey can figure this out, right? And then for some reason, one of the executives, one of my bosses, said, "No, this, I want to bring in a firm to do usability testing." And so we hired this firm, and then I watched 10 people in a row just stumble through my interface and get confused and frustrated, and just kind of like just getting angry and just being so shocked that the way that other people see things is not the way that I see things. And in fact, that applies to everybody. And especially if it's something that you've designed, that you've created, you really cannot know how other people perceive it until you show it to them and watch them. And of course, large companies understand this very well, right? Google is famous, for example, for just, they usability test and A/B test everything, the colors of the buttons and because they know that even if you've been doing something like this for 20 years, you still really can't put yourselves in the shoes of somebody who's never seen whatever you've created before. And so that's, kind of why when I was talking about how I was developing the courses, I'm basically sort of usability testing them every time I teach them. And I'm always adapting based on how people are responding to the content. And so that has those 3 traits, I think, have served me pretty well over the years.
Perfect. So you're working a lot, I guess, but what's your favorite hobby for balance?
This is going to be another weird one, but my other sort of major field of interest is really self-defense. So for the last 4 years, I've been studying something called Krav Maga, which, my wife signed our family up for at one point, and then they stopped and I continued. And it's pretty violent. It's not martial arts, it's self-defense. It's like how to, basically how to come out of an assault alive. And so even though I'm at very low risk of being assaulted, I live in Canada, it's a very safe country. I mean, I guess I travel, but I just found it fascinating as a system, It's incredibly practical. It's very logical. The way it's taught is sort of, they align it with, people's sort of natural instincts. Like if somebody were to take a swing at you, right, you would put your arms up, and that's how it starts, right? And in fact, I realized that there are in fact many parallels between Krav Maga and teaching Krav Maga and teaching data visualization, oddly enough.
Great. So last question, maybe the hardest one. A German phrase that you still remember from your school days.
Ich kann ein bisschen Deutsch sprechen, aber nicht viele.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks a lot for being that open to our listeners, to giving them some insights into the person of Nick. And now we also have those 5 questions. The first one, I think it's a very easy one for you because it's probably part of many of your courses questions as well. Mm-hmm. And that is, what is a dashboard for you, and what is not a dashboard for you? So maybe just think out of a definition of a dashboard and how you maybe distinguish different types of a dashboard.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to cheat again and change the question into
that was not part of our discussion. No, that's fine.
What do most people think a dashboard is? I think it's a much more useful and interesting question, really, to ask. Right? It doesn't matter what I think a dashboard is. It matters what other people think dashboards are. And in my experience, most people consider a dashboard to be basically any display with a bunch of charts on it, right? If it's a display, it's got a bunch of charts on it, then most people call it a dashboard. Certainly a lot of dashboard experts would object to that and say, no, that's wrong. But I think that's where you kind of have to start, right? With what people know and the way that they use these terms. And I think that this works fine a lot of the time, right? Like if you say, for example, I'm a dashboard designer, then everybody, most of the time, they have a pretty good idea of what that means, and it's going to be, generally correct. Where that starts to become problematic is when you're actually designing dashboards. Because when you think about it, if a dashboard is any display with a bunch of charts on it, that could be referring to an incredibly wide variety of different types of products, essentially. That could be a display on a piece of industrial equipment that's giving real-time information about the state of that machine. Or that could be a slide in a sales presentation that just happens to have a bunch of charts on it. Or it could be an infographic. Or it could be like a KPI dashboard that is supposed to improve the performance of the organization in terms of achieving its strategic goals. And so if as dashboard designers, we use this single term to refer to all of these different types of information displays, we're going to be in trouble. And in fact, I think that we have been in trouble really since the dawn of dashboards, specifically because of that, right? As you probably know, this is just a field that's just laced with controversies and disagreements about best practices, and everybody has, differing opinions. And I think that's the ultimate reason for that really is that different people are thinking of different things when they're arguing about dashboards, right? One person is thinking of something that is more like an infographic, whereas the person they're arguing with is thinking of like a real-time display that's going to be used by an air traffic controller or something, right? And so of course they're not going to agree.
So maybe just to make that clear also for the listeners, because they are often in the business intelligence field or in controlling and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So maybe just the 2 areas where you can distinguish it. I mean, you kind of described as saying, okay, there are these live data dashboards or stuff like that, and then there are the static ones. So yeah, maybe just make this distinction and work that out a little bit, how you differentiate those two and make clear what you're continuing to discuss then afterwards.
Yeah. So I realized a number of years ago that if we wanted to talk about best practices, we had to stop talking about dashboard design best practices and start talking about best practices for designing certain types of dashboards. And so just through experience and working with many different companies, I realized that there are about 8 different types of dashboards out there. And the way that we go about designing each of them is very, very different. And so I have sort of a taxonomy that I teach in my courses, and that's in the book. And at the highest level, there are really 2 groups. There are what I call live data dashboards, which of course are dashboards that are based on data that is updating. It might be updating every 10 seconds, it might be updating it once a month, but it's live data. And then you have static data dashboards, which are dashboards that are essentially based on a static snapshot of data that may never be updated, right? And so every time the user looks at it, it essentially looks the same, right? It might be interactive, but it's the same data all the time. And right away, when you start to segment things that way, you start to realize that the best practices that apply to each are very different in terms of even basic things like, should it have more of a sort of a plain minimalistic visual design, or should it be more kind of eye-catching and slick? Well, for live data dashboards, plain and simple. For static data dashboards, often, graphic designy, slick. And so right away you start running into major differences in terms of best practices. And then once you start subdividing within that, so I have 5 types of live data dashboards and 3 types of static data dashboards, you start to really see just how different these different types of information displays really are, and just how nonsensical it is to talk about dashboard design best practices without talking about what kind of dashboard you're actually referring to.
That's totally clear. And I really like that, really, this distinction saying, okay, clearly state out, especially in the companies we work for, it's usually about those live data dashboards. We're not more or less in this creative atmosphere. We're really data-driven and controlling business intelligence, marketing statistics, whatever, something like that. So we like to focus on the live data dashboards. And underneath, there are even other types of a dashboard you like to distinguish. Can you also briefly describe them, and also maybe give us an idea why you think this separation is very, very useful and practical in the daily practice of so many practitioners?
Sure. Yeah. So you're right. Most of the people who attend my workshops are really, they're involved with live data dashboards. The main reason why I even include static data dashboards is that people do call those things dashboards, and they cause a lot of confusion when it comes to dashboard design best practices, right? And so I include them in the taxonomy, but I spend maybe 20 minutes on them in my workshops because they're just a different kind of thing, right? They're really infographics. So for live data dashboards, there's the main types are what I call status monitoring dashboards. And these are dashboards that just answer the questions, the most common questions that people have, which is like, is everything okay? And is there anything that requires my attention? Right? Usually, is there anything going wrong? And those are actually the hardest questions to answer, because invariably there are, it's not unusual for there to be thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of things that could be going wrong at any time, right? If you're a large retailer, right, you sell 50,000 products on your website right away. Well, there's 50,000 things that could be going wrong, right? Or if you operate in different regions, you have different business units. Well, once you start looking at all of the combinations of possible, product lines in different regions and things, you're quickly into thousands or tens of thousands of things that could be going wrong. And so we spend a lot of time in the Practical Dashboards workshop talking about how do we do that? How do we surface problems from amongst so many possible problems so that people spot them right away, and they're not hidden behind clicks or filters or tabs, because that's typically the way people try to address that problem, right? Is they'll say, okay, we can't show everything all the time. And so we'll just, we'll have a filter and say, okay, you can just look at one business unit at a time or one region at a time. But the problem is then that those problems become hidden, right? If you don't happen to look at the right combination of filters at the right time, you don't see the problem, right? You miss it. And so there are ways of addressing that, but it's certainly beyond the scope of a short podcast like this.
For sure, yeah.
And then, so within those status monitoring dashboards, I actually have 3 types. There are role dashboards, which is like, for the CEO or for the account rep, right? There are area dashboards, which are, like a marketing dashboard, for example, about an area of the organization, or even about call center number 7 in our network. Well, that's an area of the organization. The third type are entity dashboards, which are essentially a dashboard about a single type of thing, right? And so a dashboard about our customers, or a dashboard about our employees, or a dashboard about all the transactions we processed in the last, X number of years or whatever.
So the entity is then the smallest part, and then the area comes, and then the role more or less. So that's
right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So entities are associated with areas. Areas are associated with roles. And so what you end up with is essentially kind of a network or an ecosystem of dashboards that are all interconnected. And I found that this works much better than trying to drill down within a single dashboard that tries to basically answer all of these different types of questions for all people all the time, right? And so, like I said, it's drilling down among dashboards as opposed to drilling down within dashboards, because I just found after banging my head against that problem for years that it just doesn't work, right? You need a different approach, and so I like to describe it as an ecosystem of interconnected displays, most of which are generated dynamically, right? And so, even though in theory there would be, potentially hundreds or thousands of such displays, there are usually only a couple of templates that are just kind of populated with data. And so there are those three types of status monitoring displays. There are also performance displays. Performance displays answer a very different set of questions, which are questions like, are we achieving our strategic goals as an organization? Are we performing better or worse than we were before? How can we perform better in the future? And so those are much more strategic. They're going to contain a lot less information, 15, 20 carefully chosen KPIs, which is a whole other topic unto itself. And most organizations don't understand the difference between status monitoring and performance assessment and improvement. But they're really two very different activities. And this is one of the major reasons why I think most dashboards fail, is because people try to create dashboards that do both.
We are making this Swiss knife approach, maybe more or less.
Exactly. I call those Swiss Army knife dashboards.
Army knife, yeah, something like that.
Yeah, because you basically you're trying to combine a bunch of capabilities into a single tool, but what you end up with is a tool that does nothing well, right? Swiss Army knife, is it's not a good saw or a good magnifying glass, right? It's a shitty one. And so you're much better off pulling them apart and having purpose-specific displays. And so there are those three types of status monitoring displays, there are performance displays, and then there are canned analysis displays, which are basically like mini applications that you create in order to basically allow non-analysts, non-statisticians to answer potentially complex analytical questions that they keep on asking over and over again. And so you can sort of, if people keep on asking the same question, you might decide to automate the answer to that question and then just give it to them and say, okay, whenever you want, you can now answer it for yourselves. But again, that's a very different kind of dashboard, I'm making air quotes here, than the other types. And then there are three types of static data displays, which are largely around sort of persuading people of things or explaining things to people or just getting their attention. But again, those are really very different kinds of animals, really.
But I think just that you do this separation, it's always for setting up a dashboard or thinking about your requirements. I think this is really crucial. And we also have these separations. We have more or less this guided dashboards and the analytical dashboards. So for us, that's the status and the performance. They're similar from our perspective. But I also get the point how you separate them, but maybe more or less in the status field here. So these are the guided dashboards, and then they're the analytical dashboards. And really having this separation really makes so many things clear, and also, again, define best practice in a completely different way. So that's, I think, having this overarching idea right from the beginning. And then if you define your dashboards, and I also like this ecosystem approach, it's not one dashboard, you cover everything, just there may be many smaller aspects of a dashboard or the whole ecosystem who makes sense of all the data you have. And I think this is also a very clever approach. And that's also the experience we gained in our customer workshops.
So now we know what a dashboard is and what types there are. But now I come back from the workshop learning all that. And what should I do in my company when I want to build a new dashboard or redesign my dashboard? How should I go for that?
Well, throw out all your current... No, I'm just kidding. Don't throw anything out. Scared when I start talking about this kind of thing in workshops. No, obviously you can't do that, right? And so what I typically suggest is you start essentially, keep what you have, right? People are going to be upset if you just start, replacing things, willy-nilly. But start building that parallel system, start building the ecosystem in parallel as people ask for new dashboards, right? And so let's say, I don't know, the head of marketing comes along and says, I need a dashboard for my role, right? To tell me if everything in my area of responsibility is doing well, or if there are things that require my attention. Well, with this sort of taxonomy, with this framework, you would immediately recognize that, okay, they're asking for a role dashboard. And so then you know how to build those now because you took the course. And then you can maybe start with that, right? So the first dashboard in the new ecosystem just happens to be a role dashboard for the head of marketing, but it could have just as easily been something else, right? You basically want to be demand driven. And so, for example, maybe people have been nagging you for a long time about a customer dashboard. Great. Okay, maybe that's the first dashboard of the new type, right? In that case, it would be an entity dashboard, right? Because it's a dashboard about a single type of thing, which are customers. And so, oh, great. We talked about those in the workshop. And so you'd start by building, a customer entity dashboard. And then, as you start building dashboards, they're going to start to connect with one another, right? Like, for example, the dashboard for the head of marketing, it's probably going to have a link to the customer entity dashboard, right? And so, this, like I said, it's hard to cover in such a short time, but basically, it'll be very logical to users that, there's going to be a section on the marketing dashboard about customers, for example. And if they click on that section, well, that's going to bring them to the customer entity dashboard, which is now a whole dashboard that's only about customers. And so, but they don't have to understand that this is actually a different type of dashboard, because one of the things that I recommend is you actually make status dashboards and performance dashboards look very similar to one another. And so it starts to feel like a cohesive application. So as people are moving from one dashboard to another, even though they might start with a role dashboard and then click on something and go to an area dashboard and click on something and go to an entity dashboard, that's completely transparent to users, right? All they have to, the way it looks to them is just, I start off with a view that's useful to me. And if something in that view looks interesting, I click on it and I get more information about whatever I just clicked on. That's the training program if you've done it right? Which is far simpler than traditional kind of dashboards.
Okay, what would you say a traditional dashboard would look like in difference?
Well, it's probably going to be much more kind of isolated and standalone. And this is, I think, one of the other major reasons why so many dashboards fail is because if you take a big step back and look at it from the user's perspective, the information that they need to do their job is usually spread out into, onto different, reports and, automatically generated emails that they get and application specific portals or the dashboard that came with our HR system. And so I call these sort of Frankenstein information systems because it's this sort of patchwork with no underlying logic to it. You just have to kind of remember where things are. It's not intuitive. And so I think by bringing everything together into sort of a more cohesive, logical system, that's going to be a lot friendlier to users, essentially.
But one dashboard means not only one page for you, or is one dashboard also the limitation to one page?
You mean should everything fit on one page?
Yeah.
Or is it one view? Can you have more than one view in a dashboard, or is one view one dashboard?
Well, again, my answer is almost always the same to any kind of question like that, which is it depends on what kind of dashboard you're talking about, right? For status monitoring dashboards, you cannot have filters on those. I mean, people put filters on them all the time, but all filters do is hide problems, right? And so filters are deadly on status dashboards. Whereas on canned analysis dashboards, for example, or entity dashboards, filters are essential, right? If I have a dashboard of customers, I absolutely need to be able to filter those customers by all of the various, dimensions and fields that we have about those customers. And same thing does everything need to fit on one screen? It depends, what kind of dashboard are we talking about? If you have something like an entity dashboard, yes, you want to try and get everything on one screen, because then as you're filtering according to different dimensions, you can see how, like filtering by region affects all the other, views of customers, right? You might notice that if I filter for the Western region, I notice that, they're not selling any office supplies in the Western region, right? So you want to try and get everything on the same screen. But if it's something like a A role dashboard, no, that can flow below the fold, right? No problem at all, right? And so this is one of the things that I found is with this taxonomy, you can actually start to offer much better answers to some very long-standing debates in dashboard design best practices, right? When I hear people arguing about things like that, like are filters bad or should everything fit on one screen, I'm kind of, sitting on the sidelines, tearing my hair out, going like, you're never going to agree with each other because you just have completely different, dashboards, in air quotes, in mind. But once you start thinking about them as these different types, and and as you've heard, I've given them even different names, then we can come up with much better answers to those types of questions, right? Which types of dashboards does it make sense to have filters on? Which types of dashboards does it make sense to include everything on one screen? And then all of a sudden, these questions become uncontroversial, right? Everybody looks at them as, well, oh yeah, that's true. Oh, of course. Why were we arguing about this for so long?
Yeah, and there's a lot of guidance also for defining those dashboards. It's somehow you also know, okay, this is that dashboard, and for that reason we use this template, and then you can collect your requirements and everything, and you're not always discussing. Yeah. So I really like this idea of the taxonomy.
Yeah, it makes implementation much more efficient. That's right, because once you figured out what kind of dashboard the user is asking for, which is very easy, right? Then all of a sudden, okay, that's right. That was this part of the workshop or this part of the book when it comes out. And everything else that people are talking about in blogs or even other parts of the book and other chapters do not apply to my current project, right? And so it makes it much more straightforward to figure out how to design a role dashboard, if that's what you've been asked for, or an entity dashboard, if that's what you've been asked for.
So next question. Most of the time, if I hear you speaking, you're talking tool agnostic. So you don't choose a tool, you do it just agnostically. But after all, do you have any kind of tool which you prefer maybe for your tool designs?
Again, I'm gonna deflect the question. I'm a terrible person to interview apparently. But yeah, I mean, well, there are two reasons why I never answer that question directly, because I am asked that pretty often.
I guess
the first is that I am an independent consultant, and so I do work with vendors. I've keynoted major conferences for a lot of the vendors, but I don't directly endorse products because it would harm my credibility for one thing. But the other, I guess, probably more useful answer is that once again, it depends on what you're doing, right? Even within the 8 types of dashboards, there are certain tools that are going to do a much better or worse job for certain types of dashboards. And so, I can't give a blanket answer, even if I were, to sort of try and set my objectivity aside, I would still have to give a very qualified answer. I'd have to give you 8 answers, basically, depending on which of the 8 different types of dashboards you're talking about, or even if you are even creating a dashboard, right? Like if you're doing just exploratory data analysis, you're not making a dashboard. Well, then my answer is going to be different as well.
So it's just the type of dashboard, or already, or even more for me, sometimes it's the person who's using the dashboard and what they want to do with that. So if they're more in the analyzing type, if they want to do a lot of self-service, are these kinds of question you ask as well, or is just the kind of the type of dashboard?
Well, yeah. So I think you still answer that with the type of dashboard, because what you just described is a canned analysis display. Right. If they are digging into the data, doing their own analysis, if that's what they're asking you for, then, once you've taken the course, you would immediately recognize that as a request for a canned analysis display. And so there are certain tools that are going to do a better or worse job of allowing you to create those canned analysis displays. But even there, depending on exactly what kind of, canned analysis display you're creating, because really canned analysis displays are a bit of a sort of a catch-all bucket, because they're essentially little mini software applications, and so there are there's this unlimited variety of different kinds of those. But yeah, and it would also depend even on things like how much data you have. Certain applications are going to handle larger data sets better than others. And so, it's going to depend on a lot of different things.
So you will definitely not argue to one vendor strategy rather than really selecting multiple vendors, especially based on the dashboards you're creating or the questions you are asking or the analysis you're doing.
Yeah, or even if you need commercial dashboard design products, like some of my clients after taking my course actually realized that, especially for status dashboards, it's actually simpler for them to create a little web-based application just in Python or Java or something that spits out pretty simple HTML, CSS pages, which are the dashboards. Because if you look at the some of my examples that I use in my workshops, they're not very sort of visually or graphically sophisticated. In fact, they're usually very simple, in fact. And so you don't need a lot of really advanced data visualization functionality. And so now, having said that, there are a lot of things that I would really like to see in dashboard applications, which don't exist in any applications. But it's mostly around how to, for example, link dashboards together. That's often not very easy. It's a lot harder than it should be, where if I click on an element in a dashboard, I go to a different dashboard, but that element is passed to the new dashboard. And so most of the complaints I have are not really around the visual presentation, but more sort of kind of the background functionality of these products, which I wish was better. Yeah.
Yeah, the guidance, great.
Yeah, thanks a lot for so many insights into that. I mean, there's also the fifth question. You certainly didn't have a lifelong dream of working with dashboards when you were a kid, I would guess. But maybe, you described it already a little bit briefly, how you get there. But what would your advice be for others who want to approach this topic in a most professional way? So what are your recommendations?
Sure. I actually wrote a blog post about 2 or 3 months ago called it was actually how to hire a data visualization pro, and then in brackets or become one, where I tried to answer that question. So it's more around sort of general data visualization as opposed to being dashboard specific, but it's a long article.
I've read it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, and I think I list at least maybe a dozen or so skills that span a pretty wide range, right? And in fact, sort of the typical sort of core data visualization skill set is only one of the 12, right? And so there are things like domain knowledge, like if you're creating charts about insurance, then you have to know something about insurance, right? Or decision making, like knowing about how to make good decisions, because usually that's why we're creating data visualizations, is to support better decision making. And so, I think that, if there's a mistake that people make, it's that they become too focused on the purely sort of visual aspect of data visualization, and not focused enough on all the things that have to happen before you create a chart, the kinds of knowledge that you need just to be able to know even what information you should be including in the chart in the first place. That's going to be most useful to people. That skill of sort of that I talked about before in terms of being able to try and put yourselves in the shoes of other people and try and really understand their world, their challenges, the environment in which they operate, so that you can then give them charts that are going to be useful to them. And these are skills which unfortunately I see are really lacking in a lot of people who have like data visualization titles, because they're so focused on the visual presentation. But if you read that article, you'll see it's only 1 or 2 of the 12 skills that I list there. And that article is probably incomplete. And so, if I'm just trying to think of some of the examples of, I listed a few already, but, like I said, sort of empathy, which is not sympathy. Empathy is the ability to, like I said, to sort of put yourself in the shoes of somebody else, essentially, to put aside your own, preconceived notions of a given situation. Yeah. Domain knowledge, statistical knowledge. A lot of people who create charts lack, basic statistical knowledge. And that's not just like knowing how to calculate means and medians and standard deviations. That's knowing how to spot things like survivor bias in data, how to not mistake correlation and causation, things like that. Because if you don't understand those things, you're going to plant those landmines in the charts that you create without realizing it. And so, like I said, those are a few examples. I'd recommend that people, read the blog post.
Yeah, of course, we can link it, put it in the show notes,
Sure.
and then we have it all together. So, yeah, there were, I think, a lot of impulses from your side. It was really a cool and flying discussion from my point of view. For now, it's only remains to us to say thank you very much for being here, Nick. It was really a great pleasure. And I think if our listeners have further questions, they can simply connect with us on LinkedIn. I think it's probably the same for you, or they can, of course attend your trainings, or just write you an email.
I'm the only Nick Desbarats on LinkedIn.
Yeah, perfect. That's
easy
good.
to find.
So, yeah. So Viktoria and me, it's only to say goodbye from our side. And there's quite a good tradition in our podcast is that we hand over for the last words to you, Nick, to our guest. And you can share whatever you like. And we both just say bye-bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Yeah. Well, I guess, not to be too self-promotional, but I mean, I've obviously just skimmed the surface of the things that I talk about in my courses and ultimately for the book. And so if you're interested in taking the public course at the end of April, or lining up a private workshop, obviously I'm able to explain all these concepts in a lot more detail. And so my website is just practicalreporting.com, and I hope to see you in a future workshop.
Thanks for listening to BI or Die, a podcast by Reporting Impulse. If you enjoy our content, please press the like button and subscribe to our podcast so you do not miss another episode. See you next time.